Good afternoon, students. It's Friday, and I'm recording a lecture for you guys. Chapter 8. Well, it says Chapter 7 and 8 on the PowerPoint. Industrial Revolution in America, but it's really Chapter 8 or something like it. Hope everyone is doing well and keeping up with the assignments online. Okay, so Industrial Revolution is something very interesting. It started in England in the early 1700s, 1730s, 1740s, and it basically involves a couple of new industries, just a few of them, cotton manufacturing, coal mining, and iron making. All of these things were known before. In India there was cotton, and they made cotton cloth by hand, but hand weaving. But in England they started doing it on the industrial scale. In other words, invented machines. Iron also was known since the beginning of the Iron Age, and that's about 1000 BC when the Iron Age started. But it wasn't so widely used. In particular, you'll see they started to using iron for plows, which was a big deal, even though to us it looks very insignificant. But anyways, so I'm looking at slide number 2 after the title, Industrial Revolution in America, slide number 2. Steam power, technology that moved the steamboats and railroads and locomotives, I should say, locomotives here. Let me just correct that. Fueled the rise of American industry by powering mills and sparking new national transportation network. A market revolution remade the nation. That's a quote from our textbook. So, couple of important points. Steam engine. The first steam engines were extremely primitive for our standards. They were, the latest thing in technology, where you have a piston moving in and out, and actually two valves opening and emptying the cylinder. So steam comes. So you open the valve, steam comes in. You close the valve. The piston moves back. You open the valve, exit valve. The piston comes back in, and so on and so forth. And that was done by hand. People were kind of opening and closing these valves by hand. And then a system was invented to kind of get those valves moving mechanically. And the same principle actually still works in our cars. You have a piston, and instead of steam, you blow in the gas mixture with air, and that explodes with a spark plug, if you have a spark plug, or without a spark plug, like in a diesel engine. But the same principle actually works. So it's basically still the same engine that is the basis of our moving around today. But the engine has gone through, of course, many improvements. Electricity is a different story. Electricity is called the second industrial revolution. But so far, we are talking about the beginning of the industrial revolution. Coal, boil the water, create some steam, and get the locomotive going. So the growth of the American economy reshaped American life in the decades before the Civil War. Americans increasingly produced goods for sale, not for consumption. Basically, market economy. That's what we call the market economy. It's opposition is a self-sufficient economy. In other words, you produce everything for yourself. And improved transportation enabled a larger exchange network. The same point that we had before in 1816, for instance, $9 could move 1 ton of goods. Ton is about 2,000 pounds. So a ton of goods across the Atlantic Ocean, but only 30 miles across the land. So basically, you can move things from New York to London for $9, or you can move the same amount on a mule or oxen-driven carts from New York to Trenton. That's about 30 miles, I think. Thereabout. Anyways, just a FYI, the sort of the main ideologue, the thinker who stands behind this thinking about industrial revolution is the famous liberal thinker Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of the Nations and who analyzed how have nations became wealthy, how have they become wealthy in history, various cases, from ancient history and Middle Ages, various cities in the Middle Ages, how, various communities became wealthy, and came up with a recipe how to become wealthy. And so far, before Adam Smith, we had a system of what is called the mercantilism, which is not a bad system. People it gets a bad reputation today, but it's not a bad system. It's basically common sense. Like, how do you become rich? Well, you become rich by spending less than you make. It's very simple. And you keep doing that, and eventually, either you die or you become rich. So that's the idea of mercantilism. It's especially associated with French school of economy. Adam Smith suggested something different. Basically, that you become wealthy through specialization. You specialize in making certain things, making cotton cloth. And out of cotton cloth, you make cloth, you make shirts, you make underwear, you make suits, and you name it. And therefore, but doing this, you actually grab the market and you make a lot of money. And so one of the arguments that he makes is in favor of free trade, which wasn't followed actually by the early American Republic. Early in the 19th century, American Republic was heavily protected by tariffs, and those tariffs actually made it possible for our industries to grow, because if there weren't for such tariffs, our industries would have been taken over and destroyed by the English, because they were ahead in the industrial revolution, and they became the manufacturing of the world. Famous example of how England destroyed the Indian cotton industry. There was nothing left after the English took over. So anyways, looking at the slide number 3 over here, Industrial Revolution, couple of interesting details. Industrial Revolution requires what is called capital. So we use the word free market or capital, but you need capital basically to start making something. You have an idea, you need money to make the thing. So therefore, where do you get the money? You go to the bank. And the number of state chartered banks, chartered banks are banks, allowed by the state to function, skyrocketed from 1 in 1783, that was the first U.S. bank that we mentioned before, that was the bank created by Alexander Hamilton, to 266 in 1820, and to 702 in 1840, and to 1371 in 1860. So, early American Republic, financially speaking, was chaos. Imagine not just having one kind of money, the money that we use, federally approved Federal Reserve notes, but every bank issued its own money. There you go. Here's your money. So anyways, it worked, so more or less. We'll talk about the problems with that later on. Next week, actually, when you get to Andrew Jackson. But it's also important to note that European capital also helped build American infrastructure. By 1844, one British traveler declared that the prosperity of America, her railroads, canals, steam navigation, and banks, are the fruit of English capital. Unfortunately, he was right. We don't like to admit it, but he was. Um, anyways, just to give you an idea, in this shift before industrial revolution actually in America brought about the move from the coastal areas across the Appalachian Mountains, across the Poconos and the Allegheny Mountains, and into the inland areas. Go west, young man, it's better out there. That was the saying, popular in the 19th century. 10 days into the journey at Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, a certain person, Dwight, said, "It appeared to me that we had come to the end of the habitable part of the globe." She finally concluded the reasons for so few are willing to return from the Western country is not that the country is so good, but because the journey is so bad. Anyways, it gives you an idea that for the colonial people, for places like New York, Boston, Baltimore, Philadelphia, going over to Scranton, Pennsylvania was you've reached the end of the world. Anyways, so to remedy that situation, U.S. Congress, and I'm looking at slide number 4. So U.S. Congress authorized the National Road in 1806. That's a There is a little illustration here from National Geographic about the National Road. It was you have the map of the road. Eventually, what it became in 1850s on the slide number 5. It went from Baltimore to various places in Maryland, and then near Pittsburgh, it went straight line to Columbus, Indianapolis, and finally to St. Louis in Missouri. Of course, it was built in chunks. So the first difficult part was through Pennsylvania and through Maryland, and then you would cross Ohio River at Wheeling, Ohio, and at that point actually you had a choice to continue by river, following the Ohio River all the way down, or eventually the road was built. Anyways, what kind of a road? We think of roads as asphalt. That is a product of the distilling of oil, and well, once the oil is distilled, you create gasoline and all sorts of fuels, and then what is left, you have tar left, and that tar is used for roads. That's what we use for paving the roads. Well, that technology is only about 100 years old. Previously, the technology that was used is, you can see it here at slide number 6. It was called the McAdam method, and it was basically putting different kinds of stones, gravel stone, and making it into a road. The biggest problem with the road is mud and drainage. The two big problems are mud and drainage, which are kind of connected together. So you want the surface where the water can go through, so it doesn't accumulate on the road and eventually creates mud. But you also we want also surface to be level enough to be able to travel on it. And macadam invented this method of actually crushing the stone. And usually, we're talking about basically chain gangs. Bring the stone, and gangs with people with hammers would crush that stone into small pieces, and make it into a road. And then, there was a different kind of, different sizes of stones were used, crushed stone were used. But it was traveling on a macadam road is awful. But it's the road made actually for the oxen-driven carts. So much more comfortable was slide number 7, Erie Canal, that we talked about several times last time around. And you have a picture of Erie Canal somewhere in the upper New York State to give you an idea of the size of that thing. The only problem with Erie Canal was it was slow. Ships in general moves fairly slow, couple of miles an hour. It's basically a walking pace. We walk about 2 miles per hour. So ships might be a little faster. They would go 3, 4, 5 miles per hour, 5 knots. That would be the measure that you use to measure the speed of ships. So anyways, I'm looking at slide number 8, talking about ships, is steamboats, right? Steamboats. And the American named Robert Fulton, it was extremely important in this way because he was the guy who decided to put a steam engine on a ship and connect that steam engine with the propeller and get the ship moving. So anyways, Robert Fulton established the first commercial steamboat service up and down the Hudson River in New York in 1807. And soon thereafter, steamboats filled the waters of the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. Downstream only routes became two-way highways. The ships can go upstream. Yes, they could, technically speaking, though much slower. Because if the maximum speed of a steamship is 5-6 knots, and you have a current going against it 2 knots, so it slows down to a crawl about 3 miles per hour. From 1811 until his death, Robert Fulton was a member of the Erie Canal Commission, appointed by the governor of New York, who by now was called Clinton DeWitt. And just a curiosity, Fulton is also credited with an invention of submarines. There are further stories about submarine. We'll mention it next time around. Actually, the first working submarine was invented in Paterson, New Jersey, but some more about it later. But the first designed submarine, and was kind of built, didn't really work too well. But anyways, Nautilus was designed between 1793 and 1797 by, again, American inventor Robert Fulton, but then living in the French Republic. So Fulton was one of those revolutionaries who went to France to help the revolution over there, spread liberty, so to speak. On the slide number 9, you have the drawing of the Fulton Nautilus. It's basically a sailboat submarine. Interesting idea. Anyways, you have the picture of what it looks like. It's just a curiosity thing. Makes you remember Fulton a little bit better. Slide number 9, you have the... I forgot the name of the boat, but it's... anyways, was it Concord or something of that sort? Well, you have a picture of a steamboat on the Hudson River. This is a replica, which has sails. Well, these steamboats were slow, so sails doesn't really hurt. Keep it going. Contribute something to the movement. So anyways, North River Steamboat went from New York to Albany, and that's about 150 miles. And it took that steamboat 32 hours. which basically tell you that it was traveling at the speed about 5 miles per hour. 155 miles per hour. They're about average speed. So it was slow, but it could carry a lot of weight. That is the big advantage of ships in general. Ships are slow, but they can carry a lot of cargo. As you know, the same principle still applies. You've seen, those cargo ships coming in and out of under the Verrazano Bridge into the New York Harbor, and you see how much cargo they're carrying. Anyways, I know I shouldn't be touching my face, but my eyes itch. Anyways, slide number 11 is the steamboat of on the Mississippi, and in particular, this is part of the story. How the West was won. Well, the West was what we call today Midwest. And the earliest cities in the Midwest are Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. Out of there comes the Ohio River, and the Ohio River follows the Virginia-Ohio border, which is now West Virginia-Ohio border, but that time was the Virginia-Ohio border. And it comes down to Cincinnati, a great city on the Ohio River. One of the oldest cities in the Midwest, like Pittsburgh, one of the nicest cities there, a huge industrial center, a beautiful, beautiful city. Cincinnati, Louisville, and then you get to the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. There is St. Louis, down with the Mississippi is Memphis. Natchez is the old city in Mississippi on the Mississippi, so in the state of Mississippi on the Mississippi River. And finally you go down to New Orleans. Anyways, Mississippi Delta is really complicated, so you don't have to go actually down to New Orleans. You can take there is a branch of the Mississippi that is called the Atchafalaya River that splits from the main Mississippi River and goes into the ocean straight down by the city of Lafayette in Louisiana, which is probably a shorter way to get into the Gulf of Mexico if you needed to. But normally the ship would stop in New Orleans because New Orleans was an important big city. Anyways, so these are the roadways of America, built by steam engine. So roadways, these were the waterways of America. And we're switching now to slide number 12, the railroads. We have the United States, the first long distance rail line launched from Maryland in 1827. It was started by the Commonwealth of Virginia that chartered the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. In other words, the idea was to connect the closest port on the eastern seaboard, that was Baltimore, to the Ohio River. So that was the stretch where the National Road was built from Baltimore to basically to Pittsburgh. A little bit south of Pittsburgh, but for our purposes, this was due. And that stretch of the road was crucial to connecting the Midwest with the East Coast harbors. Railroads were a much better option than roads. Roads really don't start until we get into the era of oil, and that's basically 1900s. But before the era of oil, traveling by road involved going on this macadam crushed stone roads, which is just, it was considered a great achievement at the time. it's much better than the muddy road. Muddy road you can't go through. You know, you get into the mud and it's over. You can't get out it with your oxen. So Macadam Road was a huge change for the better, but you know, comparatively speaking. So traveling on the railroad is much easier, much nicer, much cheaper, and uh, it's the same principle. Basically, look at the railroads the way they look today. You have gravel stone, crushed stone as the base, and on the top of it you have the rails. So it's basically the macadam road and two iron rails on the top of it. And but the a great advantage of these rails is they're cheaper to build. They're more narrow, and you can transport a lot over rail. You've seen those, you know, long trains passing through with a lot of, you know, containers on them and stuff of that sort. That's the railroad can handle that stuff easily, much better than the macadam roads. So in the 19th century, railroad was the future, and the first to open that future was Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company. It had the task of building a railroad from the port of Baltimore west to a suitable point on the Ohio River. The railroad formally incorporated on April 24th. Was intended, well, too much detail, let me just erase that. The railroad was intended to provide a faster route for Midwestern goods to reach the East Coast than the hugely successful but slow Erie Canal across the upstate New York. The state of Maryland granted the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company a charter to build a line from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and in 1823 the Washington branch was opened in 1835. That had enormous consequences for the incorporation of the Midwest into American life and American politics. And you will see, as soon as the rail reached Washington, D.C., it was very easy to come from Ohio into the nation's capital, and soon you will have the first Midwestern president of the United States coming in from Ohio and Illinois and those areas. A lot of politicians just are coming in up and down this railroad connection from Washington, Baltimore to the Ohio River. Anyways, I have number 13 here. This is a picture from the 20th century, so this is a fully developed Baltimore Ohio Railroad, but you know, the main connection is still from Baltimore all the way to Pittsburgh, and then from Pittsburgh down to Cincinnati or to Toledo, Ohio, and eventually to Chicago, Detroit, St. Louis, and other parts of the Midwest. Anyways, that's about it. We have a picture on slide number 14. The picture of a locomotive. It looks like a monster from a gothic or a cyberpunk novel. This is kind of fashionable to do these days. But anyways, this is a locomotive from 1832. It has a big boiler to heat the water, and you heat the water with coal. So there has to be people there to, you know, put coal under the boiler to get the water boiling. And once you get the water boiling, the steam comes into the pistons and moves them up and down and moves the locomotive and the whole train. Anyways, you don't want to be going through a tunnel with a steam locomotive. the dirt comes from the burning coil, just comes into your face. You don't have the time even to close the windows. The windows are usually open, in the train, and then once you get into a tunnel, all the dirt comes inside. Anyways, be that as it may, in the 1800s, people considered traveling by train as a great luxury, and it is. It was a great experience. It took a long time, not as much as on the ship. On the ships, it was really slow, so you kind of enjoy yourself. But on the train, there were sleeping cabins on the train. There were sitting cabins, first class, second class, third class cabins, and first class cabins would turn into sleeping compartments, and they were what they called at the time wagon lit, French meaning like the cars with the beds on them, and that was very very genteel, so to speak, a way to travel. It was very comfortable. You had restaurant cars where they would feed you and things of that sort. So it was a great improvement in comparison to traveling by oxen-driven carts. Anyways, we have now come to slide number 15. Slide number 15 talks about two persons very famous in Chicago, because both of them were from Illinois. And, well, they're not from Illinois, but the factories that they created are connected to Illinois. One is Cyrus McCormick, and the other one is John Deere. You might have a lawnmower, John Deere, but actually, yeah, that's the same company. Now probably owned by Chinese, but that's one of the peculiarities of capitalism that we'll talk more about in the future. Anyways, in the years between 1815 and 1850, those years witnessed an expansion of patents on agricultural technology. The most famous among these, well, there were a lot of these. Some of them were useful, some of them were a little crazy. I don't know, perhaps was Cyrus McCormick's horse-drawn mechanical reaper. That's just a monstrosity. I'll have a picture. You have a picture there on 16. And, well, reaping wheat is difficult. And if you could do it, you can make it easier. It's a back-breaking kind of work, because you have to kneel down and cut you take a sickle, and basically you cut the wheat, and it just kills your back if you try to do it. So this was a machine that you attach to horses, and the horses pull it, and the wheels kind of get the whole thing going, and it cuts the wheat. So and you just sit on the machine and enjoy the process instead of doing it by hand. Anyways, made Mr. Cormick a lot of money. Just the whole of the Midwest had to have it, and the Midwest is really agricultural country. It's all flat lands from Pittsburgh to Chicago. There, the largest mountain is a pumpkin. That's a bit of a joke. Anyways, maybe not so funny now, but it was funny in the 1800s. We have John Deere, right? The steel plow. And the man who made the plow that broke the plains. That's how they called him. John Deere. And this is what it looks like. Slide number 17. Nothing really impressive. It's a piece of wood attached to a piece of iron. Big deal? Yep. A very big deal. I don't know if you've seen the lands, the soils of the Midwest, but any kind of soil, not just, but the soil of the Midwest are a lot of clay in there. So they are really hard to work on. And basically the plows were made of wood with a couple of metal reinforcements, but Mr. Deere put a good piece of iron. It was extremely expensive. Iron is, at that time was very expensive. And then, the oxen would pull this, and you will flip the topsoil, which actually does miracles for the yield, for how much you can grow out of that earth. And you flip the topsoil, you put some fertilizers there on it. Next thing you know it, you're selling, your corn in Baltimore and making millions. Anyways, that's how America was made. No, so slide number 18, we have John Deere house, built in 1836 in Illinois. That's also a huge American invention. These wooden built houses, which people who were born in Europe, like myself, detest. Never trust them. House is made of brick, in my opinion. But not in America. There was an abundance of wood in America, and therefore, 4x4. 4x4s are the main ingredient of these of American house. That's how we build them, and that's how tornadoes blow them away. I know that they're telling us that they're safe and so on and so forth, but believe me, I can't. I won't change my mind. But it's much difficult for a tornado to blow away a brick house than a wooden built house. But wooden built houses are way cheaper, and it's an American way of doing it. So anyways, that's just a curiosity. Just to give you an idea who, Mr. Deere was, and what did he do, where did he live, and kind of gives, a little bit, meat to the bone about this industrial revolution. That's what we're talking about. I'm looking at slide number 19. Free market is capitalism is not all peachy, as you all know. We are experiencing one of the downturns right now in the economy. And there is an endless argument about those ups and downs of the free market economy. The economists call it adjustments. The rest of us call it unemployment. But that's what it is. So the opposition to capitalism, to free market system, I prefer using the word free market than to capitalism, because there's a little bit of a difference there. But anyways, that's just a minor point. Opposition, starts with Thomas Jefferson, who wrote in 1816 that I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country. So on the one hand, these people like John Deere and McCormick and Fulton, they create successful corporations. They make a lot of money, and they make a lot of people happy, and they make other people, make a lot of money, and make our lives easier. I don't know. Just think about what is life like without the dishwasher. On the other hand, they become very rich and powerful and influential, and they buy their influence in politics. When they want something to be done, they buy our politicians. Supposedly that's the way democracy works. We haven't figured out another way of doing it, so it's a problem. So that's the flip side of the medal, so to speak, flip side of the coin. The debate always centered around wage workers, because what is emerging here is the northern economy that is becoming industrial, and slavery is no longer necessary. You have wage workers, and the southern economy is also shifting, Transportation now makes it easier to sell cotton. They can produce much more cotton, and therefore they do it, and therefore they need more slaves. And what the Southerners did at this point, because buying slaves actually on the international market in, I think it was 1808, it was officially prohibited, so they couldn't do it anymore. Uh, so there is a shift also within the internal market. That's what the book says, that people from tobacco growing areas shifted into cotton growing areas, slaves moved. They were sold basically for profit. But also, the book doesn't mention that there were breeding houses, that they would, encourage slaves to have children and create more slaves. So, anyways, to give you an idea how that exactly worked, nationally the slave population, this is slide number 21, nationally the slave population continued to grow from less than 700,000 in 1790 to more than 1.5 million by 1820. So it more than doubled in the time span of 30 years. Part of that is natural growth. Part of this that the owners encouraged people to, how shall I put it? But this, the Bible says, to be fruitful and multiply. Anyways, let me get back to this opposition to capitalism and the debate about wage workers. So wage workers, a population disproportionately composed of immigrants and poorer Americans, as it is today, faced low wages, long hours, and dangerous working conditions. Class conflict developed, and instead of formal inequality of the master-servant contract, master and slaves are not equal, obviously. Employer and employee entered into a contract that was presumably as equal, As we all know, it's not exactly how it works, but legally speaking, two free parties enter into contract and you signed a contract with your employer to work for them. And anyways, but the hierarchy was evident. Employers had financial security and political power, and employees faced uncertainty and powerlessness in the workplace. Not always, it depends. Like, it depends on what you're doing. If there is a great demand for your profession, you had the upper hand, so to speak. You can pick and choose which employer you want to work for. On the other hand, if there is unemployment and there are a lot of workers around, you just take any job that you can find. That's what they call today in America, like right to work or freedom. Yeah, right to work. Anyways, a big little ironic today. So we're going to slide number 20, the end of slavery. And by the early 19th century, states north of the Mason-Dixon line had taken steps to abolish slavery. Vermont, the state of Vermont, included abolition as a provision of its 1777 state constitution, very early. Pennsylvania Emancipation Act of 1780 stipulated that freed children must serve an indentured term of 28 years. And gradually, gradualism, the brought emancipation while also defending the interests of northern masters and controlling still another generation of black Americans. That's a little bit harsh. I mean, this gradualism, this end of slavery in the North was not out of the goodness of the heart of us Northerners here, but it was because we were switching to a different system of wage working, factories, production, and so on and so forth. So slavery was no longer necessary. So in 1804, New Jersey became the last of the northern states to adopt gradual emancipation plans, and that's mostly because of southern Jersey. us here in the North Jersey don't mix with the people from Southern Jersey. Just kidding, just kidding. But it's a different kind of world. Southern Jersey is more southern. It has more land, and therefore it's good climate. You can grow some cotton over there if you want to. So, anyways, that's this double nature of New Jersey, and it reflects this double nature of the whole country. The difference between the industrial north and the agricultural west. I'm looking at slide number 21. Slavery and cotton. The free black population, those people existed, mostly in the north, but also in New Orleans. Remember that we talked about it before. So, free black population was less than 60,000 in 1790. It increased to more than 186,000 by 1810. So, that population tripled within 20 years. Which gives you an indication that the amount of free blacks were actually rising much faster than the rate of increase in the slave population. So cotton, in other words, slavery is something that exists throughout history. I mentioned that before, and usually people who are not physically or in some other way able to provide for themselves, they ended up being slaves. So basically, people who we consider homeless today, those were the people in the traditional society that would become slaves. They would be attached to a certain family, they'd do certain chores for that family, and they'd become property of the family, and they'd be fed in return. That's a traditional slavery. But in the American South, beginning with the early 1800s, it becomes sort of a new kind of slavery that you can call it industrial slavery. That is, basically the southern plantation owners needed workforce, but since they already had slaves around, they were not willing to actually pay those workers. So they enslaved even larger, and they needed and enslaved a larger and larger amount of population. So it was a large-scale slavery, and there is a huge difference between household slaves, people who lived with the family, and slaves who were living in slave quarters and were just used for agricultural work, in particular cotton. What made it really for the cotton industry to take off really quickly was Ellie Whitney's cotton gin. It's a simple hand-crank device designed to mechanically remove sticky green seeds from short, stable cotton. It allowed southern planters to dramatically expand cotton production for the national and international market. That's slide number 22. That's cotton gin, and you put cotton on one side and crank the machine, and the seeds are out. Taking out those seeds without the cotton gin is probably the most annoying thing you've ever seen. So this little machine that you see here on the slide 22 created a sound that existed all the way to the Civil War and after. Slide 23, cotton and slavery. The new national and international markets fueled the plantation boom. American cotton exports rose from 150,000 bales of cotton. Bales of cotton is, like this much of cotton. It's not that heavy, but it's tightly packed. So from 150,000 bales of cotton in 1815 to 4.5 million bales in 1859, that is 1860. So within a time span of 30, 40 years, it just grew by the factor of 30. Wow, that's a lot. Anyways, so while the United States ended its legal participation in the global slave trade in 1808, that meant that Americans were not allowed to buy slaves on the international market. And it was a consequence actually of the British decision. British government banned slave trade a little bit earlier. So our ending of legal participation in 1808 was really a kind of a way to say yes, we're going to do that, but not exactly. So anyways, the British banned the slave trade in the Atlantic. Is it in 1804 or something thereabout? And then the slave traders moved 1 million slaves from the tobacco producing Upper South to cotton fields in the Lower South between 1790s and 1860, the beginning of the Civil War. So anyways, and remember those breeding factories that existed in the South. We have cotton manufacturing. Mr. Francis Cabot Lowell from Massachusetts was an American businessman from the city of Lowell, Massachusetts, for whom the city of Lowell of Massachusetts is named. He wasn't originally from Lowell, if I recall correctly. And he was instrumental in bringing the Industrial Revolution to the United States. Well, the Industrial Revolution was all the things that we mentioned in here, but it's mostly associated with cotton because cotton, items of clothing made of cotton became widely popular in this era. In particular, the underwear. So anyways, Lowell was the guy who first created a cotton mill in the United States. And cotton mill is basically where you take the bales of cotton from the South, turn that cotton into yarn, and then weave the yarn into cloth. So it is a two-step process. Lowell also pioneered the employment of women, which kind of, there is a whole chapter about changing gender roles slowly, so I don't want to dwell on it too much because we'll talk about it more later. From the age of 15 to 35, from New England farming families as textile workers. Mr. Lowell didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart or because he was a early feminist. It's because it was cheaper. So anyways, he paid those mill girls lower wages than men, and women lived in company-run boarding houses with chaperones. Well, you don't want around women to roam around freely. You want a chaperone to follow them. And they were involved in religious and educational activities. So anyways, the modern American textile mill was fully realized in the planned mill town of Lowell, Massachusetts in 1821. It was powered by the Merrimack River in northern Massachusetts. So Lowell started his mills in near Boston. You have the slide number 25. It's a Boston Manufacturing Company, the first textile mill in the United States, and the factory was located on the Charles River. But the river has a certain amount of water that you can use to turn, all the looms and all the equipment that you have on the inside. And so there is a limit, how much energy you get from that water. So Lowell needed a larger river and he moved to Lowell, Massachusetts. Anyways, you have a picture of a textile mill, the one in Boston here. And finally, you have this big debate between free labor and slavery. That's basically a debate between the wage workers, over wage workers in slavery. And just an interesting thing to conclude, in 1856, in his speech in Kalamazoo, Michigan, Abraham Lincoln had to assure his audience that the country's commercial transformation had not reduced American laborers to slavery. Southerners, he said, insist that their slaves are far better off than northern freemen. What a mistaken view do these men have on northern laborers? They think that men are always to remain laborers here, but there is no such class. The man who labored for another last year, this year labors for himself, and next year he will hire others to labor for him. So, honest Abe is trying to sell here to the waters, to the voters, the American dream. Pull yourself by the bootstraps. Horatio Alger's story, from rags to riches. You start as a laborer, and after a couple of years, you are the boss, and you hire other laborers to work for you, and you make money, and so on and so forth. That's basically the beginning of a huge political transformation, which we're going to follow first through the Whigs, Northern Whigs, who were kind of a predecessor of the Republican Party, and then the Republican Party, which Abe Lincoln was one of its founders, and it's a party of the industrial North. Today, for us, this might be a little bit hard to believe, because you can't find a Republican in New York if you were to look for him, with a magnifying glass. But it wasn't like that 150 years ago. Essentially, the Republican Party was a Northern party, and the essential belief undergirded the Northern commitment to free labor. And it won the market revolution and much widespread acceptance. So what I'm trying to say here, that this industrial revolution, we're talking about the first phase now. Basically, I tried to stay much into the early teens and 20s and the presidency of the Virginian dynasty, to not go out of there. But obviously, I mentioned Abraham Lincoln, so it took us already almost to the Civil War. But that's the first part of the Industrial Revolution. The second part of the Industrial Revolution starts a little bit later and involves a couple of other industries, chemical industries, steel making, and so on and so forth. Invention of electricity and things of that sort. So far we're sticking here with the first Industrial Revolution, and that is much as I have for you guys. I'm ending here with a quote of Abraham Lincoln, who was a great believer in the dignity of a working man, as you can see here, basically telling that, as a working man, you can make it. Anyways, that's all what I have for you guys today. It's a little bit shorter than normal, but we had a little bit more on Monday, so it's kind of even Steven for now. All right, so that's it. I'm going to upload this for you guys, and you'll watch it and hopefully enjoy it. Bye.